In recent months, up to 2 million people flooded the streets of Hong Kong to protest an extradition bill that would make it legal to transfer residents of Hong Kong to mainland China for trial. Although the issue has been brewing since February when the bill was proposed, the situation reached a tipping point in June and is still ongoing. Still curious, China has refrained from intervening Tiananmen style. So, what does Beijing want from Hong Kong? I'm your host Shivan and welcome to Caspian Report. Hong Kong is not just another Chinese city or province. It is part of the People's Republic of China, but it has its own legal system and police force. Hong Kong is distinct enough that the youth identifies itself as a separate group from their mainland kin. To get the full picture, we need a course in history. In 1842, the Chinese emperor ceded Hong Kong Island to the British in perpetuity, bringing an end to the First Opium War. China later ceded Kowloon Peninsula in 1860, ending the Second Opium War. Shortly after the First Sino-Japanese War in 1898, Britain pressured China to lease the new territories for a duration of 99 years. Collectively, the concessions make up what is modern Hong Kong, and if it were up to the British, they would never have returned it to China. For a while, the communist leadership in Beijing approved of the British rule. They came to rely on Hong Kong as a gateway for Western technology, trade, and finances. Since the city-state was better integrated into the global economy than the mainland, Hong Kong could do business under more flexible rules. The city's legal regulations allowed it to raise capital in different ways and permitted the movement of goods and people with greater tolerance than China. Soon enough, Hong Kong became an indispensable medium for interacting with the global economy, for espionage, for backdoor diplomacy, etc. In Hong Kong, the Beijing government could get things done that it otherwise could not in the mainland itself. This bargaining chip gave Hong Kong leverage in its relationship with Beijing. In the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher attempted to renew the lease on the new territories. Not only did Deng Xiaoping reject the request, but he went as far as to claim sovereignty over all of Hong Kong, including Hong Kong Island, which had been ceded to the British in perpetuity. Britain was not the empire it used to be, and Thatcher had no choice but to capitulate to Deng's demands. Under the handover agreement, British Hong Kong would return to China in 1997. Part of the arrangement was that Hong Kong would retain its legal system, borders, and government for the next 50 years. And just like that, the one country, two systems principle was invented. However, Britain had failed to introduce a working democratic system in Hong Kong before the handover, leaving the city with a political organization that combined limited democratic elections with a powerful chief executive that was appointed by a council of political and business elites. Hong Kong was an oligarchy. At the time, however, the local government looked to its economic weight as an assurance that its autonomy would be respected. In 1993, for example, Hong Kong's economy equaled to 27% of China's GDP. But any egalitarian agreement where one side outnumbers the other's population by nearly 200-fold is doomed to fail. Hong Kong's supposed autonomy was always going to depend on Beijing's will to uphold it. At around the time that China assumed sovereignty over Hong Kong, many state enterprises were liquidated and their assets sold to private investors. As China accelerated its privatization program, cities like Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Tianjin, and others developed rapidly. Meanwhile, Hong Kong's share of China's GDP took a nosedive to the current 2.9%. As soon as Hong Kong's economic weight diminished, Beijing started chipping at the city's autonomy by exploiting the faulty government structure. The electoral process increasingly excluded anti-Beijing parties and candidates until eventually the city's political and business elite switched allegiances to Beijing. The Hong Kong oligarchy, including the chief executive, came to be dominated by the Communist Party. Subsequently, the mainland government used its influence to appoint and promote loyalists within the Hong Kong government, thereby curbing the power of the city's elected Legislative Council. The process thus far had been the easy part. Assimilating Hong Kong's population was going to be a whole lot more complicated. Britain had ruled Hong Kong for 156 years. The local culture revolved around a different set of values from those under the communist mainland. Residents of Hong Kong expect the right to criticize and innovate while embracing their Chinese and Western customs. A study by Hong Kong University's Public Opinion Program found that the youth of the city doesn't even identify as Chinese. Just 3.1% of those under 30 years felt Chinese, with the vast majority seeing themselves as a distinct group. In addition, the steady immigration of mainland Chinese to Hong Kong sent real estate prices soaring. Driven by demand from mainland buyers, Hong Kong's property barons nearly doubled home prices between 2009 and 2013. As tensions developed between local residents and their mainland kin, public discontent grew. Anti-government protests were inevitable, and Beijing assumed as much. In the last few years, numerous Hong Kong activists have been abducted, lawmakers have been removed, foreign journalists have lost their visas, and anti-communist lectures have been shut down. Several of these events triggered mass protests in Hong Kong, but only once, in 2013, did Beijing back down. Every other time, Beijing shrugged and waited for the momentum to wane, including in the 2014 protests when about 500,000 people occupied central Hong Kong. The result for the current movement is likely to be the same. On the other hand, if this level of unrest had taken place in any other Chinese city, the state would have repressed it without reservations. Beijing's restraint shows that the principle of one country, two systems remains very much alive. However, the very thing that makes Hong Kong a valuable asset also makes it an extraordinary danger. The Made in China 2025, which we covered in a previous report, seeks to transform the mainland economy from the top down. Such drastic reforms are bound to trigger social upheavals across the country. As a precautionary measure, the Communist Party ceded political power to President Xi Jinping with the hope that he will steady the ship. In doing so, Xi has systematically purged political opponents and made it legally possible for him to govern indefinitely. No leader since Deng Xiaoping has held this much political power, and the country has become more repressive as a result. Hong Kong, however, is not fully under Beijing's control, and the cabinet of Xi fears that the city could act as a Trojan horse while the Made in China reforms shake up the socio-economic status quo in the mainland. As such, Xi needs complete control as his government enacts the coming nationwide reforms, otherwise he risks another perestroika and glasnost, which cost the Soviet leadership dearly. Thus, China's objective is to retain Hong Kong's commercial value while limiting its political influence. Beijing cannot allow Hong Kong to become a platform for political dissidents, uncooperative conglomerates, media tycoons, and so on. Hence, the recently proposed extradition bill. Eventually, Beijing will win the battle for Hong Kong, just as it has nearly every other time when it decided to flex its authority. That said, President Xi has a strong incentive to preserve the facade of self-rule in Hong Kong. Foremost, the city is the financial interface between China and the world. Plus, at the backdrop of the Chinese-American trade war, Hong Kong's regulations are useful for those seeking to circumvent US tariffs and import restrictions. Secondly, China will want to apply its experience in integrating Hong Kong to bring Taiwan into the fold. Using force excessively and blatantly infringing upon Hong Kong's autonomy would set a dreadful precedent. Since assuming sovereignty over Hong Kong in 1997, the mainland government has officially retained the autonomy while wearing down its de facto power. Beijing managed to do this without having to resort to extreme measures such as sending in the Chinese paramilitary forces. This gradual erosion of Hong Kong's autonomy is likely to continue until it becomes nothing more than a pretense. I've been your host Shirvan from Caspian Report. Credit goes to our Patreon community for making content like this possible. If you want to learn more, visit the link in the description. Thank you for your time, and Sarol.